Hey, welcome to the stream. I'm Josh Rushing, sitting in for Femi OK today. Today we're talking about gentrification, how it impacts a culture and a community. And it's really kind of at the forefront of our mind right now because the stream staff and myself, we saw this fantastic film, artfully done film on Netflix called Residue. Here, I want to share the trailer with you right now. Check this out.
These white folks gonna paint over the city like we never existed. Paint right over us. I'm trying to tell this story for you. I'm trying to tell this story for Dion, for Demetri.
You ain't that important. You ain't saving nobody. You damn sure ain't saving me. They don't act all sad now. Don't forget you left us. Where was you at? You wasn't here. You was out Cali living a life, while we in the city trying to survive. You come back in the city now and talk about something where Demetri said like you really care. You ain't care. You really care about yourself.
Man, it's so good. So good. So what we're going to talk about in this episode of the stream is the issue kind of behind the film, gentrification. But we're lucky enough to be joined by the director and writer of the film for a conversation about the film itself, the art of it, the making of it, all that kind of stuff. Join me live on Instagram after this, about a half hour after the show. It'll be ajstream on Instagram. We're going to have a great conversation there. Look, if you're watching this via YouTube right now, see that box over there to the right? Those are live. That's a live chat. Those are live questions and comments. And we have a producer in there right now waiting to get your comments to me so I can get them to our guest today. So help me out. Be a part of the show and join in right there. Now, speaking of our guests, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves for you. Merawi, can we begin with you?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. My name is Merawi Gerima, writer and director from Washington, DC.
Oh, man, we're over the moon. We're over the moon to have you. Writer and director of Residue, which we just saw the clip of.
Residue,
Brandy. Yeah. Brandy, jump in.
Hi. Thank you for having me. I'm Brandy Summers. I'm an assistant professor of geography and global metropolitan studies at UC Berkeley. And I wrote a book that focuses on gentrification in DC.
Dr. Brandy Summers. Thank you for joining us. And Dietrich?
Yes, Dietrich Asante Muhammad, Chief of Race, Wealth, and Community at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Have been focused on the racial wealth divide, racial economic inequality for the last 15 or so years, and have been doing some reports on racial inequality in different cities.
Great. Hey, thank you, everyone, for being with us. Now, I want to bring in a video clip from someone in our community. This is from an associate professor of urban studies and planning at the University of Maryland at College Park named Willow Lung Amam. She's going to set the issue up for us here.
Urban development is any kind of social, economic, or physical investment into a city or urban neighborhood. Gentrification is a particular type of neighborhood change that results from massive influx of public and private dollars and higher income residents into lower income neighborhoods, particularly communities of color. It's difficult to imagine this process happening without some displacement of established residents. But there are equitable development strategies, such as investments in affordable housing, small businesses, and community and cultural amenities that can mitigate these impacts.
So, Merawi, you're from DC. You have roots here. You went away to school and came back. Was it the leaving and coming back that did you sense the gentrification in DC, which is, by the way, DC is one of the most gentrified cities in the country. Can you talk about that experience and maybe is that what led to the film?
Yeah, I mean, I basically came back to a desolate place, that I totally, was at a loss trying to identify what I couldn't find places that I had gone to. I was on 9th Street looking for 9th Street, which is like, if you know, kind of that whole section of DC, kind of how much has changed to the point where you don't even recognize the streets that you're looking for, even if you're standing on that street, So to me, it was just a moment for me to kind of take hold in any way that I could, and really nobody really wants to feel powerless like that in their own city. And for me, it was like the only way I could grab onto something, was, my mind to use the best weapon I had, which happened to be film at that time. So, Residue was kind of just born out of that desire to not feel powerless in DC.
And Brandy, is DC different in some way when it comes to what's happening with gentrification?
No, I actually think it's a great example of the violence, honestly, of gentrification on specifically Black neighborhoods and Black residents. And so there's this way, and just I'm glad clip of Dr. Lungamam to kind of really talk about what gentrification is. It's this influx of capital in these previously disinvested neighborhoods that most often have Black and Latinx populations in them. But gentrification doesn't have to happen. You're seeing it, of course, in large metropolitan cities, but it also happens on a smaller scale in smaller cities. But ultimately, what ends up happening is this physical displacement as well as a cultural displacement that I think Residue just shows so beautifully. And it's really kind of about how it feels oftentimes beyond the economic impact of it.
Can you kind of walk me through a little bit of how we found ourselves here? Like it begins with redlining, right? And then just the kind of steps to how it ends up being a Disney-fied neighborhood at some point.
Yeah, so, if we think historically, a number of Black impoverished neighborhoods in cities like DC or Chicago, Brooklyn, Oakland, they were formed in a lot of ways by government policy. So if we think about the period during the Great Depression, the government was trying to enlarge the middle class. And so what they tried to do was encourage home ownership through these, 30-year mortgages. But restrictive covenants prohibited Black people specifically from buying houses in certain neighborhoods, and more limitations like redlining, which barred prospective buyers in these areas with larger numbers of Black people and other people of color from receiving these federally insured loans. So you see this way that it wasn't just about white people fleeing the city, it was more so that they were driven and invited to come. And we see suburbanization, which ultimately leads to the disinvestment of these urban cores. You see large-scale abandonment, and then this transition with reinvestment, with these public-private partnerships. And in a lot of ways, we see how this city change is impacted by economic conditions, like, recessions or depressions. But also there's this form of displacement that occurs, again, specifically targeting Black and Brown and Indigenous people. But it's moved on so much further, even in the present day, since the foreclosure crisis in 2007 and 2008. We're seeing these extreme ways that there's an affordability crisis and people aren't able to stay in their homes.
Dietrich, it's not just DC, right? This has happened across the country. I'm curious, do you see how COVID is impacting this?
Yeah, and even before we get to COVID, you were saying, it goes back to redlining. I would say it goes back much farther than that. I think, director's very familiar with the famous film, I believe, by his father, Sankofa. It really does go back to enslavement, this idea, of white supremacy. And I really think that word powerlessness really is presented throughout the film. And I think it kind of shows the powerlessness of Black communities that have historically been economically disenfranchised. I was thinking a lot as I was watching the film about Menace to Society, a famous film that talked a lot about what happened to the urban centers when the jobs had left and Blacks that had come and they're kind of the next generation had come without jobs and kind of left to the drug trade, and the powerlessness in that film. And I think that this film shows the powerlessness in gentrification. And what's so kind of stark about this is the neighborhood is getting better, but the people who are living there's lives isn't. And I think that is something that we really need to talk about if we're trying to actually address racial economic inequality, or if we're trying just to create new places for higher income people to live and further ignore the history of racial inequality and the contemporary reality of racial inequality.
It can really kind of erase a culture, right? In fact, we have a clip that I want to share with you, and this is about a fish place over on H Street. Guys, can we pull that up? I'm going to...
Well, the different clientele is the clientele that took the area over. They call it gentrification. I call it cultural genocide. And that's all it is, you know.
All right, my baby. No problem. Anybody else just want fish by itself? How many?
Before you had black pharmacists, you had black doctors, you had black banks. Now you got Whole Foods and Walmart. You take a neighborhood with a black business in it. As a child, when I came up, that gave me a sense of who I was. Now these kids have nothing to look up to.
That fish place, Horse and Dickie's, has served fish there for 30 years, and I believe they shut their doors in February. That's part of a documentary that's being put together right now. Cultural genocide is something he said that really caught my ears. In DC, the black community has a specific music that came out of that neighborhood called go-go music. Show this this gathering here. Do we have that? The Don't Mute DC? Yeah, pull this up. Check this out. This is a movement. Brandy, can you touch on Don't Mute DC and the go-go scene in DC and how it's threatened by gentrification?
Sure. So I want to again encourage everyone to see Residue, because some of the opening scenes, it seems as though it's filmed in that neighborhood during the Don't Mute DC movement that was taking place last year. It's this prime example of this Black cultural property that existed, that was bred in DC, that was discordant, that was noisy, that was too much for the new residents who came in to the neighborhood. So the story is that, there's a location in Shaw, Central Communications, that was a T-Mobile store, and the owner, Don Campbell, would play go-go music for the last 20 years, every single day from 10 to 7. And there were complaints from a nearby residential building where there was a white resident who basically kept calling the cops, kept calling the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs, basically saying we need to shut this down, it's too loud, right? And so there's this way that go-go is DC, but go-go is Black DC. And so when you have someone calling and saying that the music needs to be shut down and muted, unfortunately, the T-Mobile or Verizon called Don and basically told him to shut the music down. And he did, and it went silent. So the movement was really organized around this muting of DC, that it wasn't just the music, that it was the culture, and that we needed to address gentrification writ large. And so they were connecting it to so many other areas in Black life, specifically in DC, and how dispossession shows up. It brought Black folks to the street. And actually, that's what I want to say in response to this idea of us being powerless. I don't know that that's necessarily the case, right? I think movements like Don't Mute DC, where Black people stay in the street, stay in place, show that there is this resilience. It's just that it's not necessarily recognized by the state. There are ways that Black folks are doing all kinds of things to remain in place, despite the fact that we may not own as much property, have as much land, but certainly movements like these are making a difference in changing how we see the violence of gentrification in everyday lives.
Well, Robert, there's a character in your film when you say give voice to the voiceless, and he says, "Yo, who's voiceless?" Right. It's kind of what she's saying, right?
Yeah,
go ahead. You're saying something.
Nah, I agree 1,000%. To me, like, my favorite part about this whole, explosion that she was describing for you, when those white folks called, whoever, they kicked up a hornet's nest. They had no idea what was about to happen. And it was a massive explosion. It was a massive cultural reaction. You know what I mean? It was a massive, cultural response to the issue at hand. And to me, it was just singularly specific to DC, because all these cities that are really undergoing intense gentrification are fighting it in many different ways. But I just felt that the specific cultural response that DC came up with was unique to our city, because go-go really stood as a spearhead that everybody could get behind, because it is, it's far more than just the music. There's a whole fashion behind it. There's, the music itself, the dance, but also the music itself, and, it is extremely irreverent. You know what I mean? It really does not, does not respond well to authority or being told what to do. And also comes out of this whole history of being criminalized by the city itself. And so I think all this, kind of accumulated, kind of history and kind of emotion behind the culture itself really created this amazing display and pushback from the city. And I agree with you. I think that like what we find is that we are not powerless, but I think these reactions come from, a feeling of our our claim or our stake or our, ability to like maintain our home being challenged, and I think that like it's only through like, resistance to these types of aggressions that like, we see these incredible displays of like, these displays of like popular reaction and response, which I think is the way forward anyway. So I just felt that like DC Go-Go really holds the key for DC, you know what I mean? And we'll see what it is for other cities as well. But like, really like even with the film itself is that like our culture is our best weapon. You know what I mean? It's one of our best weapons against this thing because it entails everything, our history, our economics, everything kind of comes out of that, and so, yeah, so I just thought that moment was so beautiful. So it was important for me to open the film with that. Actually, in that clip that you showed, I'm there in front of Backyard Band because I was like, I got there early to be, like in their face with the camera. But yeah. Yeah.
I had two questions for you on that. One, so were you already filming Residue when that happened and you thought, I just got to get down there? And two, did you have that opening scene in Residue already filmed where he pulls up and he's unloading the car and a white neighbor says, hey, you're playing your music too loud? Or did that come as a reaction to that whole thing?
Oh, nah, I mean, the Metro PCS thing, that was old. Like people, that happens all the time, like white people, they have some visceral response to go-go music, you know what I mean? I'm not surprised, that like, this thing happened in the same way that it happened in the film, even though we shot that scene, 2 years earlier. That was in a script I wrote back in 2016 because something similar happened to me and my dad, years ago. So, entitled white folks is nothing new, and the way that they tell you to turn your music down or to do this or do that is, it's old news. But, the thing about the scene, that moment kicked off in 2019. We had finished filming in 2018. I was in the middle of editing, but we had developed the style of just, filming everything that we could, every bit of evidence of gentrification that we could as we were making the film, so that I was just in my mind, didn't know how I was going to use it, but knew that I had to get it on camera. One, for the film, but two, also for, this other purpose of ours, which was to literally document Black DC, as best we could. That was really the driving, this Netflix stuff, like all that is very cool, but like really the main purpose of the project was to create a record of our existence, you know what I mean? In the city and especially in Q Street, these neighborhoods slated for demolition, to really just get as much of it on camera as we possibly could before it's too late.
Look, I've got to tell everybody right now, hold on, DJ, let me do this. I want you guys to make sure, everyone who's watching this on YouTube, that you follow ajstream on Instagram, because we're going to talk a lot more about the movie Residue right after this. It'll be about half an hour after the show, and I'm really excited to get into it. So I want you to join us there for that Instagram Live. I need to bring in someone from our YouTube audience, and Diedrich, I'm going to kick this to you. This is from someone who goes under the name Fed Up Sista. Socioeconomic revitalization without gentrification is possible if the people work for it. Can you riff on that for me?
Yeah, I mean, I will put forward, the idea that it's the poor, it's the residents themselves that aren't taking responsibility for stopping the gentrification, that isn't the issue. I mean, it is a structural challenge, right? I think even pre-gentrification occurs, DC, many cities, our society is very segregated, right? I remember going into DC as a youth and realizing, wow, the parts that we do field trips in is like predominantly white. It's like 80% white. And then there was DC that at that time in the 80s, what have you, was like 80% Black. So they're very different divisions and very different investments into communities. And I think what gentrification shows is when you start having high income white residents come into an area and those local residents are never, valued and respected for, to ensure that their communities keep going. And I think, again, just getting back to this idea of powerlessness, I guess the reason I'm a little bit more less optimistic about it is that I don't really see in parts across the country very successful movements over time in stopping this type of gentrification. I'm looking for this, but I think we haven't seen for the last 20 or something years as more and more people of color are being pushed out into the suburbs, and not pushed out in a positive way, but kind of creating new quote unquote ghettos into suburban areas. And so, I'm hoping we can look at this and figure out, well, what structural policy changes are we going to make that really, there's been these Black Lives Matters protests. How can we really make sure Black Lives Matter, Black cultural institutions matter, and that it matters to have areas that are predominantly people of color, but that are invested in and not are just left and alienated.
So the one thing I'll say is that oftentimes policy, we rely so much on policy to answer our problems, and we're learning. I agree with you. Policy is not the answer in a lot of cases, or at least it hasn't been. So maybe you're suggesting that, we come up with the right policies, but ultimately, cities end up being complicit in the way that they invite this new crop of residents, and consumers really, they want to grow the city rather than bringing people to the table. And so I think that's why these cultural movements, political, go ahead.
Hey guys, let me bring in another voice. Yes, he's asking if the cities are complicit through policy, and I think most people would agree that policy does drive it. I want to bring in, this is a professor from Georgia State, law professor named Tanya Washington Hicks, to talk about policy, and then we'll come back on this point, Brandy.
I would encourage communities to find the 20-year plan for the city in which they live. Most cities have one. It may be referred to as a comprehensive plan. It may be referred to as a strategic plan. But whatever it is called, it offers a 20-year vision for how the city will evolve. And communities need to not only figure out what this plan is, but they also need to devise their own plan so that they can exercise some agency around how they intend to evolve, and also protect themselves from a strategic plan by the city that doesn't include them in their future.
Diedrich, does that sound right? Everyone should find this plan?
Well, yes, and that we have to be real clear. One, I don't think there's necessarily the will. I think most cities haven't found the will to say, yes, we value our African-American residents, our Latino residents, our working class residents, and we're going to ensure that whatever development occurs does not come at their expense. Most cities are so excited to get some, more money into it, they will push around the working class, poor communities and push them out so they can have higher investments. So I think the question is, when will cities, when will states, when will the country say, yes, we do value these communities, and we're going to make sure that whatever economic development occurs with them, not at the expense of them, which is gentrification.
Speaking of questions, we have a question for Merawi. This is from someone in our YouTube chat named Deborah Gerima. It says, I'm an Ethiopian and immigrated to San Francisco Bay Area with my parents when I was a teenager. My question is how Merawi views immigrants' impact on gentrification.
Well, so interestingly enough, DC is like, they call it Little Ethiopia. There's a massive Ethiopian population in DC. And so there's like this, super interesting interplay, of like, Ethiopians who are like recently arrived, and then like Ethiopians, who came a long time ago. My father's Ethiopian, by the way. He came in like the 70s. And like his generation, the children of his generation, which have like grown up, and are unable to distinguish themselves from Black people. You know what I mean? I think that like that's important because
hey, Merawi, I've got to stop you because I've only got 30 seconds left. Yeah, I've only got 30 seconds left. And what I need people to know is I'm cutting him short, but you can hear the rest of that answer on Instagram Live in about half an hour. Follow ajstream on Instagram. We will continue this conversation. Right now, I have to thank all of my guests. I think this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you for being with us. And for you in the audience, join us on Instagram Live. I'll see you in just a few minutes.